Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our Your Vendor's SOC Report, What and How to Review webinar. My name is Abby Clark, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use, including Ask Question, Media Player, Slides, Related Content, Speaker Bio, Request Demo, and Help. If you're not familiar with our webinars, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide those widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right-hand corner of that widget. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout each session. We will be answering some during the webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. Today's live session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. If you wish to receive this credit, please remember to answer all of the polling questions that will appear on your screen during today's presentation. You will also be sent a follow-up survey link 24 hours after the live session that will need to be completed as well in order to receive the CPE credit. With us today, we have Lisa May Hill, VinMinder's Director of Information Security Operations. She will help you identify which type of SOC report you need and how to review them. She will also explore the various sections of a SOC report and guide you on what to look for and how to assess the risks. You'll also see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, links to our What to Do If Your Vendor Has a Negative SOC Report infographic, our Understanding Subservice Organizations Within Vendor SOC Reports infographic, and our Reviewing and Understanding a Vendor's SOC Report interactive guide and PDF, as well as a link to our library of additional resources, all within the related content widget. So with that being said, I would like to hand it over to Lisa. Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Abby. We have a lot of ground to cover today, so we're really going to focus kind of on these 5 areas. First being the benefits of a thorough vendor SOC report review. Then we'll talk about some examples, when you need to obtain a SOC, the different types. And then we'll do a full walkthrough of reviewing a vendor SOC report, including understanding timeframes, and then the sections within. And then we'll touch on reviewing complementary user entity controls and associated risk with that. And then we'll wrap up today with some key takeaways. All right, let's get started. So for some of you that may have taken any of our previous webinars on SOC reports, you'll kind of maybe have seen this slide before or similar slides, because we always kind of like to kick off these discussions with making sure we're all on the same page and have a baseline about what a SOC report is. And really a SOC report is a document that's designed to provide information to you or your organization, which is referred to as a user entity, on 3 primary components. The first being the controls that a vendor has in place to protect their system. And then the controls that your organization needs to implement to assist the vendor in accomplishing some of those controls. And then independent testing of those stated controls that provides some type of assurance that the control environment is as presented. And so what does that mean? Ultimately, a SOC report is a document that shows you, the user of a product or service, that the vendor is doing everything to the best of their ability to protect their system and your data within that system. And we'll talk about the different types of SOC reports, but understanding the fundamental goal of a SOC report is important. SOC reports are really intended to provide you, as the consumer of the product or service, that user entity, with insight into how that vendor is reducing your risk by having appropriate controls in place. And that's the key relationship, is it's really supposed to be showing you how they're reducing your risk. So a lot of people ask, when do we get a SOC report? When should we be using that as part of our due diligence process? And the nice thing about SOC reports is that they are really great at all phases of the life cycle, but specifically in onboarding, ongoing monitoring, and in offboarding. So an onboarding is part of your planning and risk assessment during that kind of working stage with your vendors, even that vendor vetting stage. And then as part of your due diligence during that onboarding stage. And then because SOC reports are renewed on a regular basis, you can also use them as part of your ongoing monitoring. Understanding the inherent risk and criticality of your vendor is always going to be key in those beginning stages to determine how you're going to proceed with your due diligence. Specifically, what are you going to look for from a control environment perspective? And SOC reports are a great tool for that. So when we talk about the when, we want to talk, more about onboarding, vendor vetting. You also, though, don't want to forget that even your vendors that you have today, if you start to use a new service or product or have any kind of new usage with a current vendor, that's also an opportunity to review SOC reports, especially if a vendor is relatively large and has specific SOC reports for each specific product or service. So what you may have reviewed during their onboarding may not be relevant to whatever new product or service you're using now. Of course, annually and ongoing, SOC reports should be reviewed at a minimum on an annual basis. However, the reality is that a lot of vendors put out multiple SOC reports a year. Perhaps they do their SOC reporting quarterly or every 6 months, and so you want to be paying attention to that. And then situational. Were there exceptions or issues the last time you reviewed a SOC report that are going to require you to follow up more quickly? And then, like I said before, as new reports are available, like I said, a lot of vendors are doing more reports in 1 year than just doing them annually, so you just want to be paying attention to that as well. Another question that we get relatively often is, who should be reviewing these SOC reports? And you just have to remember that a SOC report and the review of a SOC report shouldn't be a checkbox activity. So you really want to make sure that you have somebody reviewing them that understands them, understands the nuances of them, and can really kind of dive deep into the narrative, the testing, and not only read what's there, but identify gaps, things that should be there that aren't. There are a lot of roles that can take on this responsibility. In some organizations, it's the business units, and other organizations, it's information security. Other organizations outsource. And really the importance should be on expertise, experience, and qualifications, right? So, people always want to know, what kind of certification should people get if they're going to look at SOC reports? And we always recommend certifications like the CISM, the CISA, the CISSP, the CRISC, the CTPRP, and simply just because it gives you a really robust knowledge about information security. And that's really what you're diving deep into these SOC reports for most of the time. Okay, so we're really going to start diving into the different pieces of SOC reports. And before we do that, I just want to mention the kind of different kinds of SOC reports that you primarily might see across your desk. And that's going to be the SOC 1, the SOC 2, the SOC 2 Plus, the SOC 3, and the SOC for cybersecurity. The SOC 1 is designed to review an organization's internal controls as it relates to financial reporting. A SOC 2 is going to examine an organization's controls over one or more of the 5 trust service criteria. A 2 Plus is going to take that SOC 2 and combine it with another well-known framework to kind of map them together for you. A SOC 3 is actually a summary of a SOC 2 audit, and it is easily attainable without an NDA, but should not really be used for due diligence. And a SOC for cybersecurity is seen less often, but it is basically a SOC that really covers and deep dives into a cybersecurity risk management program at the organization. And we'll talk a little bit more about each of these as we go. As we go through this webinar today, we're going to talk about different scenarios and when will we ask for certain reports. And here's an example of a question that we get a lot is, what do I ask for if I have a critical technology vendor like a data center or a credit card processor, or we outsource our technology infrastructure. You know, what kind of SOC should we ask for? Should we ask for a SOC for cybersecurity? Should we ask for a SOC 1 or a SOC 2? And ultimately, in this type of scenario where you have a critical technology vendor, somebody that you are dependent on that will impact your availability to your customers or your consumers, or is a high risk, so they're processing credit card information or PII, you really should aim to get a SOC 2 Type 2 if it's available. If they have an option, you want to take that SOC 2 Type 2, and in the off chance that they have a SOC for cybersecurity, that would also be an excellent choice. We don't see a lot of SOC for cybersecurity still today, but they are becoming a little bit more popular, so it does not hurt to ask. But really, when we're talking about technology vendors, you always want to ask for that SOC 2 Type 2 if they have one available. That is the recommendation in this particular example. Okay. So as we dive into the different components of a SOC report, it's good to know that for the most part, SOC reports are set up pretty much the same across the board. SOC 1s and SOC 2s obviously address different areas, with a SOC 1 really focusing on financial reporting and a SOC 2 primarily focusing on trust service criteria. So, you know, you're going to see a little bit of a difference there, but ultimately when you're talking about sections, most SOC reports, if not all SOC reports, have the same 4 sections, which is going to be an independent service auditor's report, the assertion from the management of the vendor, and then section 3 is going to be a description of the system's operation, which is the narrative, really the bulkiest part of the report itself. And then section 4 is going to be testing. Whether it's a Type 2 or a Type 1, which we'll talk about a little bit more down the road. Section 4 is going to be kind of showing you, demonstrating to you that controls are in place, they're operating effectively. One section that's not on here is section 5. That's because it's not required. Section 5 is an optional section, and it usually just is filled with information that kind of helps you take into account different areas of the report, but it's not tested. It is not an audited section. A lot of times you'll see business continuity and disaster recovery information in a section 5, or management's response to exceptions will also be there as well.
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. As a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This first poll question is, does your organization consider SOC reports essential to the onboarding or ongoing stage of your third-party risk management lifecycle? Yes, no, or you're not sure? And Lisa, it looks like right now we have some time to answer one of the questions that have come in so far from the audience. And that question is, what is the best practice when a vendor SOC report is missing data you are assessing as part of your TPRM program?
Thanks, Abby. That's a good question. I mean, ultimately, first, I would want to figure out why it's missing. So a lot of times the information that I'm looking for is missing because it's part of a subservice relationship or it's explicitly scoped out. And if it's something that the vendor uses a subservice for, then I want to understand that and then decide if I need to then evaluate that subservice organization as my fourth party. If it's scoped out, I want to know why. Is it on another report? Is it taken care of by an internal group that maybe isn't covered in this report? Ultimately, I go into all of my SOC reviews knowing that what I expect to be covered from a control perspective is appropriate. So, you know, I know what should be in there. And so if it's missing, I would just recommend, you know, kind of understanding why it's missing and then evaluating if you agree with that. And then going back to the vendor and requesting it. Is it a separate report? Do you need to get, you know, permission to evaluate that subservice? So really understanding the why first is going to be important.
Thanks, everyone, for answering that poll question. Here are those results. And by the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or a heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the Slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. We're about to walk through how to review a vendor SOC report. So before we do, I want to remind you that you will find our Reviewing and Understanding a Vendor SOC Report interactive guide and PDF available for download in the Related Content widget. This is a fun interactive guide that covers the steps of reviewing a SOC report. It is available as a PDF, which you will also find within the Related Content widget. Lisa, I'll hand it back to you.
So when you are ready to sit down and actually review the SOC report, we really recommend that you go through the key areas and the sections as they're laid out in the report, right? So, the first thing is the SOC timeframe, and then determining if a bridge gap letter would be helpful to have correlate any gaps in time. And then you want to read through that service auditor's report and then the management's assertion. Make sure you're familiar with the organization's description of its systems and controls, that's Section 3. And then, control objectives, activities, and tests and controls, which is Section 4. And then I always do recommend that you do look at that Section 5, even though it's unaudited. The information in Section 5 can often be really helpful. So when we talk about SOC timeframes and reviewing that first off the bat, you want to make sure that you understand what you're looking at. So a report can either cover a period of time, which is typically a SOC type 2, and that covers controls that were in place and operating during a time frame, and it's typically 6 to 12 months. So the vendor has to provide evidence that controls were in place and operating over a span of time. A SOC can also come in where it just covers a point in time, which is a type 1. And this is a representation of controls on a specific date, and it includes a review of the suitability of those controls. So really, a type 1 is a vendor's assertion that controls were in place and suitably designed, and a type 2 is a vendor's assertion that they were operating effectively. So there is a difference there, and you want to make sure that you understand what you're looking at because it does matter, in the grand scheme of your SOC review. So just to reiterate, type 1 versus a type 2 report. A type 1 report typically just demonstrates that a control exists. Type 1 reports are assessed for being in place, and type 1 reports can often be considered less mature or be over companies that are considered a little bit less mature. Maybe they don't have enough time to where a SOC type 2 makes sense. A type 2 report is really going to demonstrate that the control is actually functioning, that it was working, operating as it should. And type 2 reports, we feel typically demonstrate that it's a more mature control environment. So with a type 1, you would almost expect to see a type 2 be their next iteration of their SOC report. You want to grow into that type 2 if you're starting off as a less mature organization. So bridge and gap letters kind of come along with SOC reports often. And really what they are is they are a document or a statement that the service organization isn't aware of any material changes outside of what they list in that letter in any gap period between the end date of the SOC report and the start date of a new SOC cycle. Gap letters are interesting because they truly sometimes are only as good as the organization writes them, right? So you want to make sure that you're understanding what that bridge or gap letter is trying to cover. A bridge or a gap letter is not a replacement for a SOC cycle or a SOC report. So it really should only be covering the period of time between the end date of the report and the start date of the next cycle or the fiscal year end. because ultimately a gap letter should be to cover a short period of time. If it's covering an extensive period of time, I wouldn't accept it as a true bridge or gap letter. And you want to make sure that you're understanding, which report it covers, which product it covers, and then what the language in it is. Were there any material changes? And how are they be able to validate that there were no material changes if the time period is larger than what you would expect to see? Okay, so when we talk about doing your SOC review, the first page really is that Independent Service Auditor's report. This is that assertion from the auditor, kind of outlining what they did. And really the top thing that you're going to pull out of this section 1, is going to be the opinion. There are 4 primary types of opinion. There is the unqualified opinion, which a lot of times people get confused and think this is a bad thing, but unqualified is really what you want. The auditor feels like the vendor's description fairly represents the system, controls were suitably designed, and in the case of a Type 2 report, that the controls operated effectively. You're probably not going to see the word unqualified in this area because ultimately it's what you would expect to see. So it's kind of like a no news is good news kind of thing. If it doesn't call out a different type of opinion, then it's unqualified. A qualified opinion, this is, also a very common opinion to receive. This really means that the vendor had at least one control objective that was not operating as designed or was not implemented as it should have been. This is also very common, but it's something that you definitely do want to make note of. A disclaimer is used when there isn't any evidence to prove or disprove that a control was performed or was in place. This happens a lot on controls that surround what we would hopefully consider rare occurrences like breaches and communicating incidents. And an adverse opinion is just bad. It means that the vendor held back or modified information needed to verify controls were in place or operating effectively. An adverse opinion is a definite red flag and definitely needs some type of follow-up. I do want to go back really quick. I apologize to the unqualified opinion. I do want to point out that even though an unqualified opinion is good, there can still be exceptions and there can still be findings. So even if there's an unqualified opinion, which is what you want to see, you still do want to check on the control activities and objectives, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So the next section in a SOC report is usually the management's assertion regarding the effectiveness of controls. With this section, you're really just going to find the written assertion of the vendor's management, right? It should describe the service organization system and that, to help the auditor perform the audit with certain reasonable assumptions in mind. There are some primary clauses that are often included, things like that the management description of the service organization system fairly presents the service organization system that was designed and implemented during the reporting period. Management has to assert that the control objectives stated in the description of the organization system were suitably designed to achieve those control objectives. And then defining the criteria used to effectively make those assertions. And then for a Type 2 report, that the controls were consistently applied. So really, it's the management's, stamp of approval that they did everything they were supposed to do in good faith, and that anything that was found makes sense based on what the work that they put into it. So Section 3 of a SOC report is what I always call the meat of the report, and I say that because it's the narrative. It is basically all of the information about what is going to happen in the testing. So it talks about the organization and administration, which is, information about the vendor. It may include when the company was founded, their location, executive and senior management structure. When you're looking at this report, you're really going to want to make sure that the following pieces are included. What's the tone from the top? Is there board of director and executive leadership support of risk management? Things like security training, policy acknowledgement. Do they have a third-party risk management plan? And then, of course, subservice organizations. You know, it's important to understand those pieces as well. This is also where you're going to find that products and services. It's crucial to read about what you're reading about because a lot of vendors have tons of products. And we're seeing more and more individual SOC reports for individual products and services. So many vendors have several SOC reports for different products, and they could all be different. So you may need more than one report for the same product. You may need different reports for different products. So you want to make sure that the report that you're looking at is the one that you want to be looking at. You'll see a lot of organizations now outsourcing information technology, payment processing, call center report, data centers. So a lot of times in order to evaluate the product or service that you're using them for, you'll need that product report, but then you'll also need the report that covers those outsourced materials as well. Section 3 is also going to give you a lot of information about things like the information system. So understanding what type of information your vendor processes and how they protect it. With this, you really should consider things like server security, network security, access management, vulnerability management, system management. Those are all things that you can learn more about how the company is doing right in that Section 3. Same thing with data center information or server rooms. This is going to help you better understand the access controls, environment, the monitoring of that infrastructure, or if it's carved out. You should consider things like physical access controls, environmental controls, monitoring controls. Those are all things to be looking for when we're talking about the data center, and will usually be represented in that Section 3. And then complementary user entity controls, or CUEs. We're going to talk more about these later, but these are controls that the vendor relies on you, the user entity, to implement in order to achieve those vendors' control objectives. So what you should consider here is, what do you already do to meet those controls? What do you need to do? And then how to document it.
Our second poll question of the day is, do you have information security experts review your vendor SOC reports? Yes, no, it depends, or you're not sure. And Lisa, I have another question here that I think we can go ahead and answer. And this question is, do bridge or gap letters really matter?
So that's interesting because, you know, they're there for a reason. They matter if you're going to pay attention to them and if they make sense. So a good gap letter is going to be used to give you a level of assurance that a vendor's leadership is on top of their SOC cadence and that they understand and take that seriously. So a gap letter really just allows a vendor to bridge any time gap between the end of their reporting period and the fiscal year, if one exists. I wouldn't necessarily be alarmed if there's not a gap letter for a small period of time, but in the converse, I would be very concerned if a vendor tried to use a gap letter to cover a significant amount of time, right? They're not intended to cover a SOC period. So, you know, you really just have to kind of look at those dates, see if it has impact, and then determine, you know, does it help you better understand? Does it bridge a small amount of time until that next SOC period is coming around? But I wouldn't be so stuck on them that, you know, I get upset if there's not one to cover a month period. So you just have to use your judgment. They do matter.
Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. I would like to quickly direct your attention to the related content widget where you will find our Understanding Subservice Organizations within Vendor SOC Reports infographic available for download. Okay, Lisa, let's continue with the presentation.
So subservice organizations are going to be another important data point to look for within SOC reports. especially as you're reviewing the organization's description of its systems and controls. So that's going to be the first area that you're going to see a notation of whether subservice organizations are used. And understanding what subservice orgs your vendor uses is important because they may be using subservice organizations for critical controls that impact the product or service that you contract with them for. So some key components are, service providers that are used by your vendors. The report should clarify exactly how subservice organizations are used, and they're usually in either an inclusive or carve-out method, with carve-out being the one you predominantly see. And that basically means that their controls that they cover are not included in that SOC report. The inclusive method is used. It is rare, but it means that they are, the audit firm is also testing those controls at the subservice location. So you do see that sometimes, but for the majority of reports, you're seeing a carve-out method. Subservice organizations are important. They're your fourth parties, things like data centers, infrastructure of technology services. So you want to make sure that you're paying attention to those and really digging into what subservice organizations are used and for what and what that impact is to you, because you may in turn want to review them as well. Okay, so moving into section 4. A lot of people jump right to this section when they're doing their SOC reviews. They'll read the auditor's letter, and then jump right into the control objectives, activities, and test of controls. Within this section, you're going to find a couple of things. Obviously, it's an examination of control objectives and activities. So this is where the firm can identify and or test the controls in place to determine if they're in place for a type 1 or if they're operating effectively for a type 2. In the case of a SOC 2, you'll also find that the specific control parameters for the trust service criteria. Trust service criteria are security, availability, processing integrity, and confidentiality and privacy. They're the foundation of the controls that are tested within a SOC 2. And an organization can pick one, security, or they can pick security plus 2, 3, 4, or 5, or be audited on them all. You'll also find information about COSO principles. In a lot of cases, the incorporation of COSO often overlaps with trust service criteria, and they build upon each other, so it's important to consider them during your SOC review. But you'll see a lot of that in this section 4. Here is just a quick reference guide of some critical questions to consider when reviewing the COSO principles. You can use this when reviewing the different COSO principles within that SOC report and just ask yourself these questions. Okay, so we're getting into the good stuff in section 4. SOC reports are built around the vendor's control objectives, and these are overall goals for a function. Control activities support the control objectives. So auditors create tests for those activities where they may review or observe or interview, all just to determine whether the control is in place, and then for type 2s, whether they're operating effectively. If that testing doesn't go well, or if there's nothing to test, then exceptions, or in more severe cases, significant deficiencies and material weaknesses are going to come into play. You don't want to see any of these, but ultimately exceptions are very common. Exceptions occur when not every single sample tested passed. So you want to look at those and risk rate them. You want to make sure you're pulling in the management's response, and if one wasn't given, that you're asking the vendor for one. And then you want to also look for mitigations in place so that the vendor has corrected any exceptions found. A significant deficiency is when a control or a combination of controls are shown not to be working as designed, or if the control is being performed by someone that's not qualified to do so. Material weaknesses come from testing, showing that controls are not functioning at all. This results in the client not being able to rely on that function of the vendor. Far less common, significant deficiencies and material weaknesses are super important to notate if found. And, you know, the thing I want to remind you about exceptions is that they are very common, and they can run the gamut from everything from, you know, 1 out of 400 employees did not sign off on their security awareness training to, you know, unidentified vulnerabilities were not found during vulnerability scanning and testing. They can be severe, they can be high impact, they can be low impact, they can be low risk, they can be high risk. So really understanding them is very important. So to kind of summarize that opinion component and exceptions, you want to look at the opinion in the beginning to determine whether the report is unqualified, and if not, what qualified the report? Why was it not operating effectively? If it was unqualified, okay, but then you want to go and look for any exceptions. You want to determine the impact to your organization from those exceptions. So understanding the exceptions and what the actual impact to you is. Then you want to take into consideration management's response if one was given, and whether there are any mitigating or compensating controls in place to lessen the impact of the exception. A lot of times vendors know that an exception is going to occur, so they already have controls in place. And so that's why you want to make sure that you're reading through the entire exception, the management's response, and understanding, you know, what that overall impact is to you. One aspect that many users of SOC reports don't know when we're talking about control design and exceptions and control testing is that the organization that is undergoing that SOC review with your vendor is actually the one that writes and designs the controls, not the auditing firm, not the firm. The control wording is included within the audit report, as are all the tests that the auditor performed. So when you review the report in detail, you can better determine the value of the report to you, right? Because it's only going to be as good as the organization that created it. A SOC is still a better tool than trying to review a vendor's policies and program documentation or interpreting questionnaire responses or putting all that together. At the very least, the SOC report controls are transparent and they're audited by a third party. The reason I bring this up, though, is because, you know, controls can really run the gamut of complexity. You can have a control like, you know, vendor A might say logical access is in place. Vendor B might say logical access is in place and then have 5 controls after that that outline, you know, the password parameters, the access reviews, the different types of time frames for termination, and those are all individually tested. That's obviously more in-depth, more robust than vendor A. So you just want to understand what you're looking at and make sure that you're kind of using the lens of, is this what I would expect to see from this type of vendor? So our next favorite thing to talk about is complementary user entity controls. We get asked a lot of questions about these as well. Complementary user entity controls, you may also hear them called CUEs. That's what I say. Some people call them CUECs. Some people say CUEC. Does not matter. They're all the same thing. They can also be referred to as user control considerations or UCCs. And ultimately, it all means that these are controls that the vendor has included within its system in which the user entity, which is you, must implement to ensure that the vendor's control objectives are accomplished. So in short, it's what you have to do to make their controls work. It's basically an out. If you don't do the complementary user entity controls, they cannot guarantee that their controls will work. CUEs are documented within a SOC report in different ways. It's usually just depending on the preference of the vendor and the firm performing the SOC review. They can be in Section 3, they can be in Section 4. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So there are 3 really important reasons to review the CUE section. One is it's essentially a control guide provided by the vendor to help protect your organization. The vendor is letting you know what you have to do in order for their controls to be supported and effective. It's a map. If controls are missed or not reviewed, this could have a negative impact on your organization as the controls in place won't be as effective or secure. And if not properly reviewed or implemented, then there's a chance for increased risk to your organization. Number 4 that's not on here is regulatory compliance, right? Auditors and examiners want to know that you're following the CUEs. Here are just 2 examples of complementary user entity controls that you may see. The first one, user entities are responsible for controls to provide reasonable assurance that output reports are reviewed by appropriate individuals for completeness and accuracy. User entities are responsible for implementing authorization policies and procedures to ensure transactions are appropriately authorized and are secure, timely, and complete. These are very common ones. CUEs often kind of align with this type of model. Here are some common categories that CUEs fall into. You see a lot of CUEs for logical access, so account provisioning, general IT controls and policies, account management, separation procedures. Is there timely account removal, regular assessment of accounts, and then authorization policies and procedures. These can ensure that transactions are appropriately authorized and are secure, timely, and complete. And then data transmission policies and procedures. So these are just some common categories that you'll see CUEs fall into. So when we talk about where to find CUEs, generally speaking, they're in Section 3. Most times you'll find them in a list or table format, but they can also be found in Section 4, which is the testing section. And when they're in the testing section, they're usually aligned with whichever control they are linked to. So you want to look in Section 3 and Section 4. And something to note, if there are no CUEs, it should be explicitly stated. So you should find a statement that says, CUEs are not necessary for the effectiveness of this product service. So you will either find them or they'll explicitly state that they're not required. This is just a little bit more detail about where to find the CUEs. Ultimately, it's just important to know that you have to look for them sometimes if there is not a specific area that they always live. So Section 3, Section 4, and then, just making sure that you're understanding what you're looking for. Okay, so you found the CUEs, but now what do you do with them? Ultimately, you want to review those CUEs and their associated control objectives to ensure that you understand the context. You want to make sure that a qualified person is doing that work. And then you want to determine which CUEs apply to you. Not all of them will, so you want to make sure you're kind of narrowing it down right away to the ones that are actually applicable to you based on your implementation of that product or service. And then you want to assign that CUE to a person or a team or a role for responsibility, preferably a team or a role, just because you never know what turnover will do to that implementation. And then you want to look at which CUEs you're already addressing through policy and procedure or controls that you already have in place. So steps 1 through 4 are going to help you whittle down to just the ones that really matter to you. Which ones are applicable to you in your organization. And those are the ones that you want to address. Once you've gotten that list kind of situated, you want to record how they are addressed. And here are some questions you can ask yourself. Is the CUE similar to any of your organization's existing controls? This goes back to a previous point. Who owns that control? How often is that control validated or tested for effectiveness? And then you want to make sure that you are assessing each CUE with each new SOC report or with any significant internal changes. CUEs are not always stagnant. They should always be reviewed with each SOC cycle. And then document. We are seeing more and more regulators and examiners looking for evidence that these CUEs are being addressed, so you want to make sure you're writing that down. Here are just some tips for mapping CUEs. As we talked about in the previous slide, it's your organization's responsibility to ensure that you're meeting any regulatory or contractual requirements with your controls. So mapping CUEs to these requirements and then analyzing what other requirements have not yet been fulfilled is a great way to do that. Mapping QEs to appropriate business units will ensure that controls are implemented by the proper people and SMEs. And, this goes along with, the previous slide where we talked about getting the right people to do that work for you. You want to consider which department would be most knowledgeable about each control and who would be able to be the best to accomplish the control objective. Assigning the implementation of QEs to a SME is going to provide you that assurance that the control objective is effective to ensure the security it's trying to create. When mapping controls in your organization, make sure the activities you are implementing are also included in your governance documentation. This will just help you aid with consistency and accountability. And just remember that QEs are designed to give your organization confidence that security isn't compromised by your vendor relationships, right? Like they're there to show that you're doing a partnership.
Our next poll question is, does your organization perform SOC reviews on your critical or high-risk vendors' subservice organizations? Yes, no, or not sure? Lisa, let's go ahead and answer another question from the audience. And that question is, if a technical vendor does not have their own SOC but provides only subservice SOC report, is it acceptable or should we require the vendor to perform independent audits?
Gosh, these are really great questions. And this is another one where it's just not a black and white answer. And I say that because the short answer is no. You can't take a subservice SOC in lieu of your primary vendor's due diligence, right? And that's just simply because your third party has to do their own amount of security controls in order for you to feel comfortable that they're doing the right thing. And then if they want to outsource portions of that to their subservice, then that's great. Then you want to also evaluate that subservice. But you still need to make sure that that relationship between your primary vendor, your third party, and that subservice, your fourth party, is secure. So especially with a technical vendor. So if you have a technology vendor that's outsourcing any part of their work to someone else, you can't just disregard that third party and move on to the fourth. You still need to evaluate them. If they don't have a SOC, then you want to go down a different path. Do they have information security program policy and procedure information? Will they fill out a questionnaire? Like, what controls do they have in place? So it's not an easy answer, but the reality is that you can't leapfrog from your third to your fourth. You do still have to do some type of due diligence on that third party.
Here are those results. Thank you to everyone for answering this question. It's always interesting to see what everyone says. As a reminder, in the related content widget, you'll find our What to Do If Your Vendor Has a Negative SOC Report infographic. This resource walks you through what to do if your vendor SOC report is filled with issues that the auditor found. With that, back to you, Lisa.
Okay, so what do you do if your vendor's SOC report is terrible, if it's negative, if there's a lot of exceptions, it's qualified? Well, first, you want to review any vendor's response that's in the report. Reports with exceptions or reports with findings oftentimes are going to have a vendor response built into it, so you can kind of assess if, what you have to do, if you have to do anything additional. Next, you really want to request clarification from the vendor. If the vendor hasn't assessed, or hasn't addressed certain concerns in the report, then ask them to. Get additional information to validate that those control areas are covered or corrected, that there's other controls in place. And, depending on how bad it is and what is bad, you might want to implement more robust monitoring. It might mean more frequent reviews. It might mean additional reviews. And then in really worst case scenarios, it may mean modifying or terminating the contract. You have to kind of factor in all the different pieces to determine what makes the best next step for you. Okay, so we covered a lot today, and we could dive even deeper into various different topics within this webinar. So Certainly, some key takeaways or just kind of things to walk away from this webinar with. First is, everybody's SOC knowledge is different, and it's continuing to grow as well. So you want to make sure that you're understanding the SOCs that you're reviewing. Part of that is going to be evaluating any fourth-party relationships. We talk about that when we talk about subservice organizations, and it's an important piece. It's a key takeaway. You don't want to go just to the third-party level. You want to make sure when you're reviewing SOCs that you also understand what that fourth-party relationship is with any subservice organizations. We talk about, too, a lot in this webinar about, the key places to look. And a lot of people start at the opinion, and if it's unqualified, they check a box and move on. You want to make sure that you're also understanding the risk and impact of any exceptions regardless of the report opinion. So an unqualified report doesn't mean that there's no exception. So you want to make sure you're going a step beyond just the opinion and also checking to see if there were any exceptions found. Reading and understanding the report, of course, coming to the table with the right knowledge to know that, what you're looking for are the right things, as well as gaps, right? So we not only want to make sure that we understand what to look for, but also be able to identify when things are missing. When we talk about those gaps in any areas of ambiguity, you want to make sure you address them and document them, reach out to your vendors, understand what that is, why it's missing. Are they carved out? Is it out of scope? Are they outsourced somewhere else? Is it in another report? And then complementary user entity controls. Of course, we talked about those for several slides. Those are a really important piece because those are the things that you are responsible for. So making sure you understand them, making sure you document them, and that you're reviewing them on a regular basis. And then, of course, we always talk about having the right people do the right reviews. So having someone with SOC knowledge do these reviews is going to be paramount. And not only SOC knowledge, but knowledge of the products and service, knowledge of technology, knowledge of the information systems, to make sure that they can really tie all those pieces together to give you a really accurate view of that SOC report for you on your vendors. So it was a big presentation today. I appreciate everybody's time, and thank you. And I think we'll have a couple minutes for questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Lisa. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I want to thank everyone for attending. I would also like to thank Lisa for her time and sharing some really important information. And on your screen now, you will see our upcoming webinars. On October 17th, our Understanding the Elements of Your Vendor's Cybersecurity Program webinar, and on November 2nd, our From the Top Down, the Role the Board and Senior Management Play in Third-Party Risk Management webinar. We hope that you will be able to join us for those sessions as well. A link to register for those sessions is in your copy of today's presentation slides. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Lisa, the next question I have here is there a typical time frame Type 2 SOCs should cover? Example, quarter, year, etc.
Sure. So a Type 2, we see everything from 3, 6, 9, 12 months, and anything is really acceptable. Ultimately, it's more important that it's consistent, right? So if they did a quarter, then they should be doing the next quarter and the third quarter and the fourth quarter. If they do it annually, they should be doing it every 12 months. So it's really just about making sure that your vendor is providing you a consistent SOC report.
Perfect. Next question I have here is it safe to rely solely on a SOC audit to assess the overall information security program of a third party?
So it really depends, right? Like, are we talking about, a technology vendor? Are we talking about a critical or high-risk vendor? You really have to look at all different aspects of the situation to make that determination. And so it just is dependent. A SOC is an excellent place to start and should always be, reviewed when available. But certainly for your really high-risk critical vendors, you probably want to go deeper.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. The next question I have here is, how often should you ask for an updated SOC? Is it as part of annual due diligence?
That's a great question, and this kind of goes along with the first question. Really, it's about cadence. So if your vendor does a SOC once a year, then I would expect to review that SOC annually. If they do 3 SOCs or 2 SOCs a year, I would expect you to review both of them, so twice a year, and so on and so forth. Now, that may not always be realistic. It may not be doable, but that's really what you should be doing because you want to make sure that you're catching any changes, right? So every SOC period, there's an opportunity for new CUEs. There's an opportunity for a change in infrastructure. So you want to make sure that you're kind of staying on top of that. So really, you want to understand the cadence of those SOC reports.
Awesome. Thanks, Lisa. The next question I have here is, how do companies handle subservice provided by AWS where our primary vendor states that AWS reports are not available for clients? Are we responsible for that subservice review, or should we just take the vendor reviews of their third party?
So that's an interesting question, and I'm curious to hear more about the AWS piece. So whomever submitted that, if you want to ask deeper questions offline, because AWS, I mean, they are usually pretty good about giving out their SOC assessments, right? They do everything by the book. So if your third party is not giving you that AWS SOC report, it may just mean that you need to work directly with AWS. But ultimately, your fourth party is your responsibility if they touch your data. So if you can't get that through your third party, then you may have to work directly with that fourth party, and that can be challenging, but it is still your responsibility. Anywhere your data touches is going to be an important thing for you to evaluate. So I would want to better understand, I think, that particular situation. But ultimately, you can start with reviewing the review your third party did, but you would have to really trust that they do the same level of due diligence that you would do for yourself.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. I think we have time for one more question here. And this question is, how much detail should you be seeing in a vendor's response to exceptions?
Oh, that's a great question. And it depends on the exception, right? What you want to see primarily is a response. So if they're addressing it and they're letting you know that they're acknowledging the exception and they've either corrected it already, have a plan for correction, or already have mitigating or compensating controls in place, those are the points you really want to look for. The worst thing you can see is somebody who says, yeah, that happened, and then doesn't, kind of like validate that it's not an issue because they did all these things.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. Unfortunately, that is all of the time that we have left for questions today. So thank you, Lisa, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions that we did not have time to answer live, we will address with you offline via email. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. And ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. So post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you'll find thousands of free educational resources related to third-party risk management topics, including vendor SOC reports to assist you. If you would like to become a member of the think tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also within that follow-up email will be this survey link for you to request your CPE credit. On behalf of VinMinder, it has been a pleasure. We thank you and hope you have a great rest of your day.